BBD, back to geopolitics. I'm coming off a lovely cigar evening on the terrace of Claridge's Hotel with a cousin who actually, I would say, probably has been part of the Indian foreign policy system for the longest of times. His dad was one of the most highly regarded ambassadors in various places in the world. One comment of his has triggered my start of this process. One realizes, right, is that, I'm not sure why, right, people continue to insist or insinuate that the US is the culprit behind everything, all that's going bad. So directly, the United States really hasn't adversely affected India at all, or India's national security. Let's just take this in some form of a kind of a rambling kind of a conversation. First, let's say they came to our help in '62 when China attacked us, that after much deliberation, what's his name, Nehru was forced to go to Kennedy. Then after that, when you had the situation when India had a famine under the PL scheme, India got treaties from them. Now, hey, all the rest of the world, right, folks? We blame them, or we are hypocritical, we call them racist, but at the end of the racist, or they've messed up the Middle East, or they've interfered in other people's lives, or it's all about oil, it's all about big money. But here, just remember one thing, right? China is where it is, not because it was historically brilliant. It's just like us, we are historically brilliant, and everybody, all the fools who believe that, really need their heads re-examined. Anybody who was part of the system of business and policy making in the United States, way back in the 80s, realized, and if you studied it enough, you know that almost everything, all the FDI becoming part of the global supply chain, let me tell you this, without becoming part of the global supply chain, China would be as much as, actually worse than what India is today. Worse. Without American money, without then subsequently, because after that everybody else poured in the money, without becoming part of the supply chain from some of the biggest brands that, for people, open your eyes, smell the coffee and the cigars, all are American, all European, all Japanese, not Chinese. Okay. China is at the back end of things. You know, start with Japan. Japan was the hub of outsourcing. Then it got to Korea. Then it got to Southeast Asia. Then obviously China. It was game because Obama gave them, or Clinton gave them, a pass on, you know, observing all the rules and regulations as per the W2, and still allowed them in. Massive currency manipulators, and they were still allowed in. They stole technology from the American companies that are still allowed in. Why? Because of the greed of Wall Street, because of the greed of Hollywood, because of the greed of consulting companies, right? And the belief that they would eventually turn around and change China around. Or one of the biggest national security threats that people talk about, Afghanistan. Really, is the United States to blame for it? Hey, I think you should smell the coffee. Foreign interference in India. Who really did it? Was it really the CIA? Bunker. It was the KGB. You got to look into the reports of the MI6 for the guy who turned coat and ran away from the KGB and into their lap, and the explosive names that he disclosed. There are, according to him, 50% of India's bureaucracy and 50% of India's politicians were on the payroll of the KGB. And you call that foreign interference from CIA, and you still now, I mean, recently there's a comment on Jaishankar, and Jaishankar is pro-American. You gotta be pro-American. Manmohan Singh realized that. He knew if India was to develop, if India needed to get to be in the Committee of Nations, it needed the money, it needed the technology. And hey guys, it ain't coming from Russia, it ain't coming from China. The only place it's coming from, folks, is where you and me, all of us, would rather be, is the Wild West, or the West. To even think otherwise is being the hypocrite to the core. You know, it's not about, I mean, you know, we are the castiest and the racist goddamn country in the world, based on our caste system, and we point a finger at what America does. Police brutality you talk about in the United States, you got to see what these cops do in UP, Bihar, and on the other places. Do you know what they do? All our sedition laws, does anybody know anything? But we are caught in this trap of colonialism and a false narrative and lies that we keep lying to ourselves of this heroic, isolationist, dim-wit, non-aligned policy. Dim-wit, non-aligned, sell-by date, expired, non-aligned policy. Junk it. You got to acknowledge and understand where the money is and where the money is come from, where the technology is, where the technology is going to come from. If you don't do that, what you're trying to do is to keep India backwards for another 50 years.
After capturing most of the Arabian Peninsula with the help of the Wahhabi Islamic warriors, Ibn Saud establishes the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
The Wahhabis were fiercely anti-Western. They want to go back in time to a pure Islam that wasn't threatened by the West.
It was by chance we discovered oil. We were looking for water.
Despite criticism of foreign presence in the kingdom, the king allows commercial oil production to begin.
The result is the first union between Saudi Arabia and the United States.
To accommodate the workforce, the first Western housing compounds are created.
The strict Islamic laws enforced outside of these walls do not apply inside.
West and East came together in Egypt, where President Roosevelt and Ibn Saud, King of Arabia.
They want America present there in the kingdom because we are their security.
The Saudi elite became notorious big spenders and lost credibility and respect among religious conservatives.
In response to the U.S. support of Israel in the Arab-Israeli war, Wahhabi Muslims pressured the Saudi monarchy to stop pumping oil.
Those who control the flow of oil hold the Western world hostage.
Prices quadrupled.
Oil was an American national security priority.
The embargo redefined the balance of power between the oil consumers and oil producers.
Iraq's battle train army swept across Kuwait's borders at first light.
As a Saudi national, Osama bin Laden offered his services to the royal. He told them he could bring his army from Afghanistan to repel the Iraqi invaders from Kuwait.
But the Saudis had a better offer. A 500 million troops from the United States. His offer rejected. Osama took to the streets and mosques to denounce the U.S. royal family and their unholy alliance.
Osama bin Laden this week again lashed out at the Saudi royal family.
We were tracking bin Laden since the early 90s. We stripped him of his citizenship. When it became clear that the 15 of the 19th...
The section before this, you'll still realize that the Middle East and the problems in the Middle East, in my opinion, were more created because of tribalism in that region, and then more you can fault Sykes and Picot, which are the French and the British, for drawing artificial boundaries there. Same thing with Afghanistan. Essentially, like I said, this was driven by the USSR. I mean, the Americans only jumped in way after that, right? The USSR invaded, put their own army in and this was in response. And similarly, if you talk about and you look at the Cold War, you've got to find out who can you lay the blame on. The first mover in the Cold War was the USSR. It wasn't the United States. The United States was always a latecomer in almost every region after the USSR was trying to promote its brand of stupid communism, right? So, okay, here's the readout, guys, and that's fun and games for you. Really good readout by A. West Mitchell, the Curzonian imprint on Indian foreign policy. He says, more than any other figure from India's recent history, Curzon grappled with the geopolitical complexities of the Indian subcontinent and its neighborhood. That he did so as a foreigner makes his insights no less Indian. Three tenets of Curzon's thinking seem especially relevant for India as it finds itself confronted with an aggressive China. First, Curzon recognized that India's security depends upon its ability to exercise influence over a defined geopolitical space beyond India's own shores. This is for all the guys who come up with the gun and butter issues, right? He identified the space as extending from the Gulf of Aden in the west to the Straits of Malacca in the east, right? So true. Curzon understood that India's security and greatness were intimately tied to the maritime routes and choke points connecting it to Europe and the Far East. Important again, lose control of these and India would be hostage to its strongest landward neighbor. Important. Second, Curzon recognized that India's main landward attention must be directed towards frontiers, namely to the task of maintaining viable buffer states in adjacent regions. It's not been able to do that. Third, Curzon understood that building influence in these neighboring spaces required India to offer an attractive commercial and strategic alternative to the charms of its rival, not been able to do it. While intending to oppose the expansion to formal empire, Curzon nevertheless saw that India needed to compete vigorously for positive influence in these regions. This required an active rather than passive policies aimed at integration of neighboring states into the Indian economy and infrastructure. We've done a very poor job of that. He says area that matters most is precisely the space from Aden to Singapore, which Curzon identified as India's natural orbis terrarium.
Should India fail to prevent China from becoming the dominant power in this space, its role as a global power will be curtailed. Also, as in Curzon's time, it is the small and often unstable states rimming this area that must be a focal point of Indian diplomacy. Maldives comes to mind. In reality, what would benefit America most is an India that is capable of consistently projecting power and influence in its own home region. This would entail a combination of localized naval and littoral land strength and deep politico-economic relations with the similar nearby states. Many of these, India will be much more effective at organizing than the US would be. India that devotes its energies to stabilize its own surroundings in what is one of the world's crucible geopolitical zones. Lucky India. Reconstitute in the 21st century the India Center that organized peace and stability in much of the Eastern Hemisphere during the 19th and early 20th century. Okay. India and other American alliances, a sui generis partnership aimed at enabling India to achieve its full potential in its own environment. That doesn't imply passivity for Washington. To the contrary, US policymakers need to devote more energy to defining the potential for this relationship, including where necessary by developing novel framework in where it can prosper. But making the most of US-Indian relationship to thwart China's advance is not a one-way street. It will also require India to continue taking on greater burden and risk than it became accustomed to in the Cold War and its immediate aftermath. Curzon always believed such a day would come when a confident, self-governing India would become a major source of stability in its own region and wider world. Time has come, but we got to take it by the straps, man. If anything, his vision is more relevant for an independent India than that is motivated to act on its own unalloyed self-interest. America and India both stand to gain from India's realization of that vision. And what does Avinash Paliwal writes? On the eastern and western frontiers. In Myanmar, India must step up support for the democratic resistance. In Afghanistan, India is now engaging with the Taliban. In both, New Delhi should aim for an inclusive political settlement. The central challenge for India's leaders then is to rise above their ideological preferences and policy conservatism, to adopt strategies that advance inclusive politics in Afghanistan and Myanmar. That is the only credible and sustainable answer to the rising assertiveness of China and Pakistan, both of whom have fueled discord in whichever country they have sought influence. And this again goes with Curzon's polity. Buffer states, Myanmar, Afghanistan. More United States that kind of blow as a storm in a teacup. That's it. India ties strong concerns over free speech curbs, detentions, US official concern over some Indian actions not consistent with his democratic values. And then you have this India, the next frontier for Netflix and Amazon titans rule on content, and that's what was happening. On the Myanmar side, Myanmar activists' death stirs outcry. There's a civil war brewing. US Gaza plan aimed to bypass Hamas. This is the other buffer for us, and India will also have to bypass the Hamas. Jaishankar meets Kuwait PM. This is a very important state that we all know and we should focus on. In Maldives, rupturing again, careful, you have to be. Ex-President Nasheed's tirade against own party worries Malé. Delhi hope to expedite talks to end global terror. UNGA President-elect who is from Maldives. Nepal, misunderstanding with India resolved, says Nepal, but right after that, what do you have? Nepal ex-PM warns against external influence. And what's happening in Afghanistan? Curzon likely to lead team to Pakistan and push for political solution. But what's happening then? Hammered Hazaras in Afghanistan grapple with another spike in killings. Bombs hit minivans in Kabul, 7 dead officials. There's separate bombs in 2 minivans in a mostly Shiite neighborhood again. What's Pentagon thinking? Pentagon plans to bomb Taliban if Kabul attack. What's Pakistan doing? Pakistan NSA. Hasty withdrawal by US troops from Afghanistan is not a good idea. I can see that. And there, folks, lies our periphery, and we will go now outwards towards our natural alliances now in the West starting tomorrow. Jai Hind.